Hi, this is Dr. John Grazel, and this video focuses on the role of higher education historically and in the future, hopefully, in international development. And as usual, just very quick effort to raise all sorts of issues and possibilities. What really is important to understand is that from the very beginning of international development after World War II, there was a definite involvement of significant university personnel just as generators of theory and practice and knowledge. At the same time, to recognize that higher education itself underwent massive transformation. In the United States, with the introduction of the GI Bill, it began to significantly change the nature of higher education, greatly expand the number of people who went to universities and almost the orientation. So there was an American revolution in higher education after World War II. Now, very quickly, one of the obvious things to help sort of affect, rebuild, or modernize societies was let's train a lot of their people. Let's train them by bringing them to universities in America. And that certainly happened, and it happened in large numbers. And to the people engaged in it, has always been considered one of the greatest and most successful of all efforts. But in fact, from the first time, there also were challenges. And they were the challenges of higher education for Americans as well. The fact that institutions tend to have disciplines, and those disciplines tend to be highly focused. So in Africa, people would tell you they went to Russian medical school and they learned all the illnesses that you get in cold countries. The desire of universities to keep the best graduates. They were training them supposedly to modernize the other countries, but then they liked keeping them for their own staff. The fact that inherently higher education people tend to have their own research agenda, and that drives what they do. And they seek a place for it rather than accept somebody else's. And then some programs on international relations, but not international in the sense of international development. And the results were that people began to say, well, there's real problems here. Inherently, the way these problems are being approached, they're not holistic. So even if you attempt something like the agricultural community did with farming systems, it limits itself to certain things. It doesn't include what the farmer does off the farm. There was the problem of the institutional realities. Academic calendars prevented many academics from engaging on a time necessary basis with development. It was always the problem of people being pressured to do the things that get them tenure rather than having an effect on the world, and having to generate knowledge rather than having application of knowledge as their first priority. And also the whole phenomenon of what we call soft money in higher education. So the minute the soft money stopped, the programs collapsed. Now, in that way, besides all these problems, however, there really was a period of tremendous substantial involvement, large numbers of trainees, tens of thousands, and very significant programs in agriculture, in health, in management, in education, that not only had effects, but created relationships that continue today, some between institutions and some between people in institutions. And then there are a series of institutions, and I can't do justice to all of them, that actually did begin to identify themselves with international development, or at least parts of them, in very dramatic ways. Michigan State University, Ohio State University, Tulane on public health, Cornell on agriculture, University of Massachusetts on education. These schools really became centers of leadership in thinking and doing. But in the end, very expensive. In fact, they piggybacked, and this is important, on the state school funding of state programs. And the fact that they began to be seen as contributing to the brain drain. Yes, they trained people, but then they actually took the people they trained and drained them from the countries that they came from, and therefore necessarily didn't help the countries, it appeared. Because of this, there also was more and more parallel concern with actually building capacities in countries. building new universities in Africa, in Asia, is building up those institutions in their own countries as an alternative. And what has resulted from that is a globalization of education. Higher education is becoming more and more globalized, that U.S. institutions, while still preeminent in many respects, are competing with Australia and Singapore and then other joint programs. So the monopoly that U.S. universities used to have is rapidly decreasing. Also, this corresponded to was the fact that so many of the outstanding universities that did development were state schools, Title 12 schools that had missions from the 19th century, but over the period of the last couple of decades have actually seen their support by their own states dramatically decrease, and having then more and more to turn to giving, orienting their programs towards subjects and involvements that bring in additional funds. And that is part of the equation that very often I don't think is counted. Now, interestingly enough, AID just a few years ago actually did an evaluation of what it called its AFGRAD program, 40 years of experience, to see what did 40 years of experience bringing Africans over actually contribute. And it came out with some very interesting things. It turned out that the participants did think that it was an invaluable experience, but the invaluable experience was not specific training in specific disciplines, but the exposure to a new mentality of questioning and research that you have out of American academic world. And so what also became evident was that that benefit was conveyed on a master's level, and that there wasn't much significant difference between master's level training and PhD in perceived benefits. The third thing that was very interesting is it turned out that the brain drain isn't quite like it seems, that even people who didn't go back to their countries very often maintained relations with their countries and did contribute periodically or from outside to their own nation. So the brain drain phenomena actually it turned out not to be anywhere near as dramatic as people thought, and in most cases was limited by the capacities of their own countries to use their skills. Where does that put us today? Well, today I think we're in a yet new world. The new world is we're in a global world with problems that have to be dealt with enormous input from, in terms of not only resources but different perspectives. Just an example of that is the CERN accelerator that's used in physics research in Europe, in which you have dozens and dozens of countries that actually have to work together, not only to use that, but on any particular problem. You no longer find single source total expertise. And that's what's happening around the world. And we're going to have to begin to create really partnerships of mutuality around the world to revise a new type of higher education, a higher education for a global world. Because what we really have now is we have a few outstanding higher education institutions that exist on their reputation. We then have a whole broad group of higher educations that actually provide mediocre education, and in many countries are actually just holding pens for younger generation people for whom there isn't employment. And then we have a new phenomenon of private higher education, some of which is very good, but some of which is really questionable in terms of what it is providing students in terms of useful knowledge. And then the last factor is that after all the years of international development, among students, international development has become a major source of interest. So American universities and European universities, and even what used to be called developing country universities, are developing programs of international development and becoming more and more popular. The question that one faces, though, is will these be new wine or old wine? Will they provide new bottles or old bottles? Will they become just another version of academic specialties that actually don't deal with things holistically? Or will they become sources of potential transformation, not only within their own institutions, but between institutions? And that is is up for grabs and actually goes into the very question of our need to change the institutions of our society, of which higher education certainly represents one of the most important.